Well, thank you, everyone. We will go to 5:30 Pacific time, 6:30 Mountain time, and have a conversation. I know on the registration page, I included the biographies of the three panelists, but they all have very distinctive backgrounds, and two of which have spent their careers in both in private sector as well as academia. David Reid is the director, is that the right, director Emeritus of
Professor Emeritus, ex-director of the Center for International Business.
Okay, well, I knew him through this the Albers Center for Global Business when I was on the advisory board at Seattle University. And David had his esteemed career as an academic. And Leo Chan, he and I met at a conference in San Jose, which is where I'm based now on the metaverse, which at the time, the metaverse was a very popular buzzword. It somehow has been tarnished a bit, certainly from investors, not from the technologists, but it seems like the investors have cooled off a bit. And Jonathan Bench is an attorney with Harris Sliwoski. Did I get that right? And so he's a partner of a good friend of mine that David and I know in Seattle, Dan Harris. And but Jonathan's got his own very interesting background, as he proudly claims he's a businessman who decided to study the law. Is that how you describe yourself, Jonathan?
Well, I'm a much better business person than I am lawyer. Let's put it that way, right? My mind always goes there first, and then I have to think, oh, right, I'm the lawyer, so I probably should think about this in legal terms as well.
in terms that none of us can understand, that we pay $500 an hour to have translated. So so anyway, but Jonathan has and I'll let all of you kind of make your own remarks, but Jonathan has an extensive background living in China. I think from your bio, you're with your wife, right? And spent time in China. And so the experience, David has significant experience in China, Hong Kong. He also was a professor in Perth, Australia, where he was doing a lot of interactions with China. And he has done a lot of interviews over decades with people and leaders, government and business leaders in China. Leo obviously is from China. And Leo, what part of China are you from?
My family is actually from an area in the northern part of Guangdong province called Chaozhou, but I grew up in Hong Kong. So
you grew up in Hong Kong. Well, I know we will talk about Hong Kong. So anyway, I've asked our panelists to give their feedback, no more than maybe 5 minutes of the discussion from the Deputy Secretary of State. This forum is an open forum. I do have a few questions I will pose, but this is an open conversation. Invite anyone on here to participate. But I'd like to start with you, David. Your feedback about what you've heard, and we'll go from there.
Most unfortunate, because I heard nothing.
You heard nothing. You couldn't even get to the link. Okay.
I got into the link, and the little bit that I was able to hear was right at the very end, and there was nothing substantial that I could make anything of.
Okay. Well, we'll have the Q&A. They'll go from there.
Happy to participate in that.
Very good. Leo, over to you, please.
Okay, yeah. So maybe I'll summarize what I heard and it briefly, so David can get a sense of what's going on. So I think it's a very good, reassuring conversation that is somewhat different than what we heard from the media. There were a lot of assurance that that the media may report one way, but what happened is that the diplomats are actually talking, and they are assuring business leaders that we're trying to make things better, as not back to normal, but it is not really a situation we're going to be like starting war over the Pacific anytime soon. And one thing that really kind of encouraging to me is Secretary Campbell was talking about the need to work with China to tackle the climate change issue. I think that's one big area that I think both countries can do a lot of work together. But I know, right now it doesn't seem like it's a fair situation because of the accounting of carbon emissions issue. Anyway, and then we'll talk about Russia and the Ukrainian war. I think that's a very candid discussions about what the U.S. understood China's positions, and that is in the conflict, and that the U.S. do understand that China do not want Ukraine to fallen into Russia's hand. And so there was a little bit of a miscalculation by the Chinese side when the U.S. warned that there's going to be an invasion there. And so that's somewhat similar to what I know. I'm just talking about other potential goodwill gestures that are going to be resume again, and that's related to not travel ban, but right now there's a level 3 travel warning for anyone visiting China, and so they're talking about that may be lifted soon, and then talking about maybe in the next few years there'll be 50,000 students from U.S. university being sent to China, or hope that maybe 50,000 students from the U.S. will be studying at Chinese universities, so that would set the stage and build the connections going forward. And then I think the most assuring thing that I heard about the big issue on the day is the conflicts, seeming conflicts between China and Taiwan. And I gotta give you a little more background about how I got interested in politics, economics, and finance. When I was a kid, 5, 6, 9, 10 years old, my father will buy this political affair magazine every week, and back then was weekly. And that was my favorite thing to do. Every week, just after my father finished reading the magazine, and I get to read it. And so that's how I learned about politics and economics from age 10 to about 13, 15. That sets the foundation for me. And that was back like 40 plus years ago, okay? And guess what was the hottest issue at that time? Taiwan. So anyone who said that China is going to immediately or potentially going to send army over to invade Taiwan, it just does not have a full understanding of Chinese history. So I thought that reassurance was kind of a good thing, and I wish more people in the administration would talk about that rather than everybody thinking one side try to fan hot air, try to provoke the other side to start a new conflict. So I don't think either country has any desire to start any kind of war over the Taiwan Strait. So I thought overall it was a very positive conversation. So I kind of enjoy it.
Thank you, Leo. Jonathan, your observations, please.
I think my observations center around two different areas, and obviously the discussion was very politically leaning, but I look for the business connections in there. So, for instance, the emphasis on people-to-people connections. This is something that I think about a lot. Business people need those connections. Educators need those. Students need those. A lot of us fell in love with China through experiences either on our home soil or the time each of us just decided we were going to take the leap and go live in this in this emerging economy. So I think those are absolutely important, and I felt like the focus on those with Dr. Campbell is is good. You know, I feel like those ties need to be improved, absolutely. And whatever way it happens, you know, getting the politicians out of the room, getting the business people in the room, getting the students in the room together, and letting, to some extent, letting each generation figure out for themselves what that relationship will look like. You know, I went to China in 2001 for the first time, to Hong Kong 2001, woefully ignorant of any of the U.S. China dynamics, right? I knew nothing at all, and that was good for me, right? To kind of go in there and figure things out for myself a little bit and try to understand, you know, who these people are, what they value, where our commonalities are. And he mentioned that capacity building is one of the hardest things in the U.S. government. You know, with the drop in the number of students in China learning English, the drop in the number of students in the U.S. learning Chinese, I'm very concerned that it will take decades to be able to rebuild the capacity that we have all built up, you know, especially through the business community, but certainly the diplomatic community. We need to make sure that we have those ties as well. So those are a couple of things, you know, people connections. The other thing that I think was interesting, and I consider it a victory for the Biden administration, is really restarting the high level diplomatic talks among the administration. You know, he had mentioned needing to build habits of cooperation, and I think what he was alluding to is we need to be able to have people on our end pick up the phone when someone calls from the Chinese government and have that reciprocated as well. And I know for a period of time, at least in the defense industrial complex, that was not happening, and so that was concerning to a lot of people, even those who were with me. I kind of share the same opinion with Leo that you know, China actually invading Taiwan would be, you know, be suicidal, right? It would just be a bad thing for China's economy and so many regional economies as well, and you know, and it wouldn't be good for the U.S. either. So I think making sure that we have those channels open, even if it's just to pick up the phone and say, yeah, I'm here, we disagree still, but at least it can be a cordial exchange rather than you know, just a dial tone or an endless ringing phone.
Yeah, on that point, Jonathan, I mean, I was surprised on the kind of a big deal it was made that Biden and Xi spoke last week. And you know, normally these calls get mentioned in the media, but it was such, you know, elation about the call. I mean, that's kind of shows on the deterioration of the binational relations between the two countries. It's just because of the lack of communication.
Yeah, agreed.
Let me go into a question of, because I know we got two academics here, and Jonathan, I know you're involved with some of the programs at schools you've attended, as well as I think you're also involved with the Utah, is the Utah Trade Association?
Yeah, World Trade Center, Utah.
World Trade Center, Utah. So a few weeks ago, I attended although I'm not an alumni of Georgetown, I know, Jonathan, you went to George Washington, I believe, in your bio, but a friend of mine that works for a law firm in downtown San Francisco invited me to an event for Georgetown alum about China. And one of the things we talked about was obviously the drop of international students that have come to the United States. That's obviously the what I call the soft power effect, but then there's also the financial effect. You know, the loss of tuition. I know where David taught at Seattle University. I attended many years ago. The budget has been constrained by the reduction of international students. But in your respective communities, because that's the focus of today's conversation, what is it that each one of you is seeing, whether it's in Seattle or the Pacific Northwest, Utah, and the Mountain States region? What changes have you seen either since COVID or really since, you know, in my mind, you have 2012 when Xi came in the power, and then you had the Trump election in 2016. He took office in January 2017. And now we have the post-COVID era. So what changes have each one of you seen? And maybe, Jonathan, I'll let you take this one first, please.
Sure. So Utah's an interesting community, is particularly because of the predominance of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So a lot of what I'll say will be tinted somewhat by that. But it's more of it's not a religious bent necessarily. It's a worldview, right? So people who grow up in this community, even people who aren't members of the church, are very tuned in very early to the idea that we're all brothers and sisters. And so, and I think in Utah, I didn't grow up in Utah, I grew up in Wisconsin, but I think that more than anywhere else I've been around in the world, it's very clear that the people in the Mountain West states, especially Utah, take that pretty seriously, right? The idea that if we're all family as the foundation, then what does that mean in terms of our goals together, how we interact together, what we owe it to each other in terms of keeping the family together versus allowing schisms to break up the family, right? And so I think that it's been very interesting from the early years, say the 2000s, when John Huntsman was governor and he instituted the dual language immersion program in Utah at the elementary school level, starting in grade 1. That was I was living away. I was on the East Coast in law school, and then in Maine after that. So I was reading the news and of learning about this and lamenting the fact that I wasn't in Utah anymore, and that my children were not able to plug into this. And it's not just Chinese, but Chinese, Russian, Farsi, Spanish, French, German. So 7 or 8 really critical languages in terms of powerhouse economies and geopolitical interests. And so I think it's very interesting to see what those seeds that were planted in the in the legislature this is both houses of the legislature supported this. So this was not a Republican versus Democrat decision. It was let's make our children more competitive. And I've had a couple of meetings, including one, a closed door meeting with John Huntsman, just a friend of mine and him, and talking for an hour plus about the wide-ranging things, his experience in China, Russia, all of that, and from his perspective, he's continued to beat the drum that the U.S. Chinese and Indians will outwork U.S. kids every time, and so he said the only way that we can become competitive or we can remain competitive is to make sure our kids are engaged very early with being diplomats, with being conversant in foreign languages and cultures. And so I've seen that grow, and so that can start in the mid 2000s, I want to say. And so about within the last 10 years, Utah started graduating the first cohort of 12th graders who had started in first grade in these dual language immersion programs. So it's it's still a lottery system. I have my 4th child, and then my 5th will be grandfathered in or get a shoe in because of my 4th son was able to get in. So we moved back to Utah. I applied to get my son in the dual language immersion program for Chinese. He's in 3rd grade now, and I'm wowed by his level of Chinese. As someone who started learning Chinese as a 19-year-old, I can still pick out his errors, but it won't be long before he will be helping me fix my errors. So a lot of I see that as a crucial part of what can and should be happening. It doesn't have to be just Chinese, but for the purpose of our discussion, we need a large cohort of American students who grow up learning Chinese just because that's normal and that's what their friends speak, and it becomes the cool thing to do in their community, in their town.
David, what's your observations in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, the contacts that I have retained with the Seattle University, it's kind of depressing because they've lost more or less all the Chinese students, and though they have been replaced, I'm told, by Indians. So it's a very radical shift. I mean, I don't know how comfortable I would be going back there right now, because it's a very different scenario to the one that I was accustomed to, and also my interest and speciality. Well, it's interesting hearing Jonathan talking about that dual language program in Utah. 2 of my granddaughters went to an international school here, and they told me it was taught entirely in Chinese. And I thought, that's great, that's great. I didn't really believe them. So one day I arranged to go and sit in on their class, and it was a math class. Sure enough, there was this dragon lady writing on the board was all in Chinese, and I must say I came away impressed. But they didn't continue with that for other reasons, and I understand that it doesn't exist in that form anymore, which is a great shame in my view. I think I agree with Jonathan, that we need to fuse the two peoples together and have real conversations and be able to communicate without hesitation or pause.
Very good. Leo, what are you seeing in back to Utah, and let me also pose kind of the next question to you as you talk about it, because more of the technology. Where is it that you're seeing? So give us your observations of what you're seeing academically in your community in Utah, and then what are you seeing some R&D trends that have emerged, particularly in the frontier technologies, either through artificial intelligence, metaverse, climate technology, both at the academic level, but then the business community as well.
Okay, so let me first talk about the international students or Chinese students coming to study in the U.S. So I'm at Utah Valley University. Before COVID, we have a few hundred Chinese students, but I think now there's maybe, I can't remember seeing anyone anymore. Probably because our business school was not as well ranked as University of Utah, but there's a few students compared to where maybe like a few hundred in the past. And the other area that is of concern is that the Trump administration start limiting students' access to majors. So students cannot study computer science or computer engineering, for example, or physics. And there's some certain states that are banning students getting into a PhD program if they're from China originally. Fortunately, this has not happened in Utah. So from the University of Utah side, where it's close to Salt Lake, and they have a bigger business school and life science programs. There's still a lot of Chinese students, but I think again the number is not as good as it should be given the location and the cost and the reputations combination. And so I think that is a great tragedy, and some Chinese program struggling at the college level because fewer students are taking Chinese courses or major in Chinese studies. So those things that really, like Jonathan said, is going to take some time to rebuild. Whereas technology goes, so there, if you look at all the AI, all the people who have created the AI, the accessibility to the AI, and are more specific right now, if you look at the people who are doing the large language model and the trends in the developing chatbots and also AI agents, it's the two biggest GPU makers. They are both Chinese Americans, though they're born in Taiwan, and TSMC obviously is now in Taiwan. And if you look at the inventors or the co-inventors of the large language models, half of them are Chinese, and 70% of them are foreign born. And so, the technologies are being the basic technology are being built by a lot of Chinese immigrants and their next generations. And so, right now, there is a pretty serious restrictions. If those scholars want to go back to work in China, they have to choose. They have to either give the U.S. citizenship, or they cannot work for a Chinese government company. And so, there's some high-profile professors in the math and basic science side that actually decided that they renounce their neutralized citizenship and return to China and bring with them the entire research team. And so I think that is kind of like a situation where you have create kind of two universe or two different branches in AI and life science development. I think that is not very good way to go, because the more people that we can have to work together, the better we will be at understanding what the issues are. And AI safety is a big issue. But the applications and also the hardware manufacturing right now are mostly done in China. And so the U.S. has the foundation research, and then you have all these models being built. But if you look at robots, for example, most robots are built in China. And the U.S. are now restricting actually U.S. companies' ability to access to some of the robots being built in China, because they're worried that there may be like some spyware embedded in those robots. So I think that is kind of the level of mistrust that I think we should try to remove going forward if we want to see a more equal playing field and more access to technology that will benefit everybody. So there's a lot of developments on the, you talk about the metaverse, a lot of developments on the AR, augmented reality and virtual reality glasses. They are being done by two companies. One is HTC, and it's based out of Taiwan, China. And then the other is Xreal. Xreal is based out of China. And so they will probably be the biggest competitor to Apple's going forward. And if we have access to those cheaper technology, I think it's going to help us, I don't know, usher in a different level of understanding of the technologies available to us, and rather than waiting for the developers in the US to come up with somewhat similar technology and at the similar cost. I think it's going to be unfortunate if we don't encourage cooperation in that side. So,
excellent, David. Let me bring the question to you, and maybe with a slight change. China historically has been known as a market of intellectual, not, well, how to phrase this more delicately, of not respecting intellectual property rights. Even in my experience working in China over the years, things have improved. I recognize that. Although I've not been back to China since COVID, and so I'm not quite sure what has changed. I no longer have business interest in China, so I'm not as intimately involved as I was. But a year ago, around this time, I was in Washington, D.C. at a conference, and we were talking about resilient technologies. And really people were lamenting on how, if there's one area the United States and China can come together and collaborate, was in environmental efforts, combating climate change. And maybe that's an opportunity through technology R&D. And someone said, very kind of, in quick response of saying, but you're still dealing with IP issues. It's just changing it from one sector to another sector. So I'd like to get your thoughts about, where are the opportunities between, transnational research and development efforts, and is intellectual property protection still the challenge that, people like me was facing when I first started doing business in China 20 years ago? What has changed, if any?
Well, just going back, the ethos that existed there was, that China had actually given the rest of the world lots of fundamental technologies. I can't think of any at the moment, but the tiller, I think, on a ship was a Chinese invention. A number of others that you could find out about. The way that you steer a horse, that kind of harness came from China. So they didn't charge the rest of the world for use of its intellectual property. And they kind of perceived that when we started talking about IP rights, that this was a way of using power, military power, secondhand, in order to force upon China and others a set of rules that they weren't really consulted about. So what happened was, eventually China began to realize it was a big deal as far as its trading partners were concerned. And a lot of people were made judges in IP courts. And these were not lawyers, they were often military people that had been rewarded by a safe position at the end of their military career. So there is an IP protection regime there, but most of the cases initially that I came across, they found in favor of the offender, the local player. And there was one major fraud that I came across, a major U.S. company, and yeah, it was kind of sad, the way that they were duped out of the rights to their IP. But yeah, the way China is playing it now is that they're talking about making a huge investment, equivalent to half of all of the investment that was made in the US in 2023, a huge investment in advanced manufacturing technology. And they anticipate renting out this technology to the US and others. They expect others to pay for the use of this technology. So it's actually, we don't like this game, but we're getting used to it. And now we've gotten used to it. Here you are, rent our technology, because you're going to need it. There's nobody else spending as much money in developing as such a sophisticated solution to problems, manufacturing problems, as we have. So it's somewhat ironical, but it's also representative of progress.
Very good. Jonathan, I have a question to you, and maybe a different take as well, is that I know you, in fact, I'll put the link in here. You've got a webinar that's coming up about Chinese businesses to expand into the US. So where are you seeing the opportunities for shared R&D, and what has changed? I guess I could have answered the question myself, as I know, because I just came to the Bay Area about 3 years ago. And so I know in Seattle, the EB-5 visas have just dropped. I mean, the money that went into mostly construction, and I remember in downtown Seattle, and it was just coincidence, Dan and I had an office there at 600 Stewart Street. And so I was on the 18th floor, and your office is on the 12th. But we would see these, projects started, and David, I think you and I walked around, and then they would stop because the flow of capital would be held up. But the EB-5s, I understand, and for those who are not familiar, that's the U.S. investor visa. But the EB-5s have basically dried up. But where are you seeing the research and development, and what kind of advice, what kind of companies from China are looking to come into the U.S.?
I think that where I'm sitting, and this is small and medium-sized companies in the U.S., let's say. I mean, we have two different buckets that I have clients in. One is outbound work dealing with China. So this is any company, usually U.S. companies, but sometimes for other non-U.S. companies dealing with something in China, right? It's something, either they're having a product made in China or they're trying to sell a product to China. So it's very much China-facing work. And we had 2022, COVID was hard, 2022, a little bit coming out of COVID, 23, again, kind of slow, and 24, I've seen pick up, in Q1, Q2, I've probably done more China manufacturing related contracts in the last 4 months than I did all through 2023. So from that anecdotal evidence, my small sampling, I see a lot of activity there, and it's being reciprocated on the China side as well, because the other side of the coin for my China practice is is inbound work. So we have Chinese companies that are starting to, and I kind of put these into two different buckets as well. I see those that understand something's got to change in the market. You know, the mandate in China is to sell more products, to export more, and so they're getting more creative about how they do that. And I see smart U.S. companies partnering up with these Chinese companies to become, if they can, become an exclusive distributor for a really good product that has been developed in China that is going to change things. For instance, I've got one client that has a partner in China, and the Chinese manufacturer has developed a LED overlay to turn any piece of glass into an LED TV, basically into an LED screen with different levels of opacity. So very, very cool stuff. And my client here in the U.S. said, we know how events are put together. We know how these are used in the retail space. It's not being used in the U.S. or in the world anywhere like this. This is totally novel and amazing technology. So they wanted to lock in the Chinese manufacturer as a primary distributor, and we couldn't get exclusive distributor rights because the Chinese manufacturer wanted to make sure that my client could sell the product, could really move the market the way that they wanted to. So I see these. I think it's a maturity process with Chinese manufacturers really understanding what it takes. Whether they do or don't have what it takes to succeed in the U.S. and other markets. And because I have other clients in China that are very smart, very savvy entrepreneurs, and they understand business as well as anyone I've ever talked to in the West. And so I see it as a maturity process. The first generation of Chinese entrepreneurs, true entrepreneurs that didn't build with someone else's money, they just built themselves. They're in their 40s and 50s now, and so they're the ones that survived have capital. They have decades of experience now as entrepreneurs, and they're determined to crack the U.S. and EU in a way that any good startup from any of those countries could do, right? Someone who grew up natively there. So I see a really interesting split between those Chinese manufacturers that just know they're good at building things. They're going to continue to iterate on processes and improve products and develop novel products. And then those that can do that, but then also recognize that they don't need a partner in the foreign country. They can do the whole thing themselves. So I'm I'm cautiously watching this just to see how it comes out. And then I've got my own clients projects that I get involved in. I can see these much deeper as well.
Jonathan, let me keep you in the spotlight here and ask you this. The companies moving out of China. We're hearing a lot about Mexico, Vietnam, in India. But let's talk about Mexico. There's a lot of companies, Mexico through the revised NAFTA U.S. MCA. I almost want to break out and start singing the Village People song, YMCA. But anyway, but we've seen some changes. The relationship between the U.S. and Mexico has gotten much stronger economically. But it's more maybe a question, but I'll make it as a statement, or I'll put it in the question. The finished goods from Mexico coming to the U.S. are assembled in Mexico, but I get the sense that those parts are still manufactured in China, and those are owned by Chinese companies. So if that's true, is it taking a hit to China? And then I'll put out the other word, tariffs. How has tariffs impacted China? And if President Biden, former President Trump is elected again in November, and there are tariffs, what's your crystal ball? What is it that you're telling your clients and how to prepare for a potential Trump presidency? So kind of two questions there: Mexico and then the potential Trump presidency.
Yeah, Mexico's a very interesting piece of this puzzle because Mexico is happy to take Chinese investment. There are a lot of Chinese companies buying assets, buying real estate, setting up factories in Mexico. So it's absolutely happening. Mexicans are still early on the learning curve of dealing with Chinese companies. I think, you know, it's going to be quite a learning curve. I can see, and so there are. You know, these questions are actually very much tied together, because as long as products, you know, raw materials coming from China, and most of the supply chains still run directly through China, the supply chains run through China, there has to be a substantial transformation in Mexico for them to be considered Mexican products. And so there will still be transshipment, which is what we've seen, you know, Chinese products being gussied up as Vietnamese products and then shipped from Vietnam. We've seen that a lot. I mean, I remember reading a case in law school where it was happening in the U.S. as well, where products were being brought into a free trade zone in China. They were being labeled as made in the U.S. I think these were pencils or something. It's a very simple product. And then they were brought out of the free trade zone and sold in the U.S. or sold elsewhere as made in the U.S. Even though they weren't. They were just painted in the U.S. functionally, and that was not enough of a substantial transformation. So that is one big issue, including with the tariffs, you know, and those tariffs that we have. I have a great trade team in my firm, and we have lawyers that just focus on these trade aspects that are where are the tariffs, how quickly are they coming down, and under a Trump administration, I would absolutely see those continuing and probably being strengthened. Right, that won't be any surprise. The one surprise, and this ties into the Mexico question. I was in a meeting with World Trade Center. A big Utah manufacturer, and they import a lot of goods, or they had imported a lot of goods from China, and they took concrete steps over the last 10 years or so to, I think they have only 50% of their supply chain dependent on China now. And so they have a big lobbying team that goes to Washington, and when they're in conversations with lawmakers, they said the most consistent question that they've gotten is around USMCA, what's being done in Mexico, but especially what's being done in the other. I think it's I'm going to mess this up with the. It's CAFTA. I was thinking CONCACAF, but that's it's a soccer tournament, right? So I knew I was going to mess it up. One of those acronyms. So CAFTA, that CAFTA is the NAFTA follow-on for the Central American countries with the U.S. So the U.S., Canada, Mexico have the USMCA, which is NAFTA 2.0, and then CAFTA countries are kind of down through Panama, right? So these Central American countries, and I was surprised, and this lawyer for this Utah-based company was also surprised at how many questions he was getting around. What are you doing in Costa Rica? What are you doing in Panama? What are you doing in El Salvador? Right, and so not just what are you doing in Mexico, but how much more are we building up Central America? So I see, regardless of the administration change or not change coming later this year, I see the Central America being a focal point, because it you know, for a variety of reasons, time zones, cultural affinity, supply chain distance, you know, product to market distance. But really, it's how easy is it for the U.S. to send ships up and down the coasts of North and South America versus having to protect the whole Pacific corridor, right? So these are the fundamental reasons why I see Central American countries as well as Mexico being prominent for decades, right? I mean, Dan and I talked about this early on when I joined the firm about 5 years ago, and I kind of looked at, we had conversations. I was looking at what was happening, and I thought it's probably a good idea for me to dust off my 2 years of high school Spanish and add that to my Chinese, because there's a good chance that I'm going to have to be trilingual now to be able to manage the global supply chain, at least as far as things coming into the U.S.
I remember when I was a Seattle University student back in the late 90s, and how many Chinese students were attending Seattle U who spoke Spanish. That was interesting, and I had a good classmate of mine from El Salvador who learned Chinese and then spent a year in China. So and that was in the late 90s. Leo, over to you. Feel free to answer the question, but I also want to get your take on the is China, when you talk to your students and teach to your students, the question, is China, despite the risks of doing business in China, is it too big to ignore?
Well, I think if you're doing any kind of international business and you try to ignore China, it's going to be crazy because that's one of the biggest markets. The problem is that over the last few years, because of the geopolitical tensions, foreign brands once had a pretty substantial premiums in terms of the pricing power, suddenly falling out of favor because of the rise in geopolitical tensions, and the Chinese media obviously play up a little bit of patriotism. So there are now more and more Chinese people are more proud of buying Chinese-made products and kind of shun some of the big names, especially the one that are coming out of the U.S. And you can see, Tim Cook went over to China, just try to do a charm offense because the sales of Apple products is falling, and Tesla just announced one of the most horrible quarter because their sales was not meeting expectations in terms of growth, actually decline, and in large part is because they are not selling as many cars in China as well. And so, there's a window opportunity still, I think, for companies from the U.S. or from Europe that they still want to establish a presence in China to get in, but that is closing very rapidly because of the ongoing geopolitical tensions, and the politicians just yelling and screaming at each other rather than thinking about what the long-term impacts are going to be. And on the Chinese side, they are the producers in China. They are managing this by a very different way. And Jonathan probably noticed that a lot of Chinese business owners, they're moving the manufacturing out of China. Okay, they set a factory in Vietnam and Cambodia, Bangladesh. Not surprised, right? So if now our clothes used to be made in China, now they're made in Bangladesh or Vietnam. But if you go to any of those factories, garment factories in Vietnam and Bangladesh, most of them owned by Chinese people, business people. And shoes, they may be made in Ethiopia. You go down to Ethiopia, there is a free trade zone with China, okay? And I think the same thing is happening in Latin America. So one of the things that I kind of disagree with Jonathan a little bit is that some of the raw materials, especially in the mineral side, they actually, China used to have to ship them from Latin America all the way to China. And if BYD build cars in Mexico, they don't have to send those minerals all the way from Latin America to China and then send the car back. Actually, it's going to be a huge saving for them. And so I think in terms of this trade, evasion of trade restriction, I think the Chinese business people are winning in big time. So we may see fewer products being made in China, okay, but majority of them are still made by Chinese business people. So I think it's very much in the best interest of U.S. business people to actually reset this relationship, to get back into China as soon as possible, to figure out what else can they actually do to penetrate the Chinese market, because there is a growing middle class that I think eventually they're going to spend more money on consumption rather than invest in real estate. So that would be one big area that I think that there's a missed opportunity right now that I think at least I'm not aware of what's going on with the U.S. China's business chamber, what the conversation is like, but that's one area that I think it's going to be a urgent topic to bring up to improve. And then one of the big area of concern for China is the financial market has been performing poorly, in large part because the infrastructures were still not there. And so there's still rooms for U.S. investment banks to play a critical role in improving the functioning of financial markets. And Aaron, you knew just how primitive the financial market operation were in China back in the 90s. But I think things improved quite a bit, but it's still most Chinese people are still viewing the stock market as a casino rather than as a long-term investment. And that will change, and that has to change. And that's, I think, where a U.S. company can actually play a major role. But I don't know how that's going to play out because of the politics. So.
Yeah, my first dealings in China was I worked a World Bank project that created a pilot project, as most World Bank projects are, but it was to establish a municipal bond, and in the northeast provinces of Zhivin. And at that time, almost 25 years ago, China, I believe, if not number one, they were one of the top recipients of World Bank funding. And the wealth was increasing rapidly, projected to, but there were so limited opportunities for investment from Chinese people. Stock markets were nascent, real estate, you really couldn't, buy real estate in those days. And certainly private business. You can't really invest in private business. So the idea of investing in a municipal bond that the interest was subsidized by the World Bank, and the use of funds was for infrastructure, as traditional muni bonds are. But it was very interesting to see the foresight that was going in. So I want to kind of go use that question to you, David, and talk about we both have a CLU connection. I'm still on their mailing list, and I know that CLU has launched programs in India. You've talked about the number of India projects that's going on. Just in general, do you see where do you see the Indian-U.S. relationship in comparison to U.S. China? What is India's relationship, globally? And so I'll leave it there. Is the question of India and the context? Yes, U.S. India, U.S. China. Is this something that China is concerned with? In many ways, it's apples and oranges, other than population, but the GDP per capita in India is much lower. Still a lot of infrastructure challenges in India. But what are you seeing?
Well, I do see a big opportunity in India, and I do have connections in what used to be called Bangalore. Now they've changed the name for some reason. And I have done some work down there in Bangalore, and worked with Microsoft and with Wipro. But what I found at the time I was there was there is a sophisticated world and a chaotic world. I mean, I don't know how it is today, but driving to Wipro, the road was rough, a bit like Seattle actually, dusty, camels, all sorts of crazy stuff going on by the side of the road. And you get to Wipro and you go in, it's like being in Stanford. It's totally different, cerebral world where everybody is very calm and quiet and pursuing these sophisticated aims. So the point of that is, of course, will they really present the sort of opportunity that we found in China? I mean, in China, everybody, it's a stupid thing to say, but there are more people, it seems to be more sophisticated. The sophistication that we all take for granted seems to permeate to a deeper extent in China than it does in India, is my perception. But there is a huge middle class in India, and it's a huge opportunity in dollar terms. So there's no reason why it can't be one of the biggest markets for US products and Western products in the coming times. Though, I don't see it. The government relationships being the factor that is going to determine the future of companies like Apple. I think that it has to deal with the problems created by the government, but Tim Cook seems to do a reasonably good job in maintaining relationships. But on the China side, government side, the relationships are all churning and they're very competitive between themselves also. So, India is good. It's good that it's there. It's good that companies are taking advantage of the opportunity. It's very sad that we have these problems in China at the moment, and I would like to think that they can be overcome. I'm not sure they will be, but I like to think so. That's the way I would be pursuing it if I was a top policymaker.
Thank you. Jonathan, let me ask you the question of both Hong Kong and Taiwan. What does the crystal ball, I mean, even for me, it's hard to conceive that there would be an armed conflict in Taiwan. I could see some mishaps, which would be very unfortunate. It's very easy to, it happens very easily, with the push of a button. But it would be, but at the same time, I didn't conceive that Putin would invade Ukraine. So, what do I know? So it's a question of Taiwan, but also you can't mention about Taiwan without mentioning Hong Kong. Is Hong Kong an indicator of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to Taiwan?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's how people from Hong Kong who I've talked to. I talked to a student here in Utah who's from Hong Kong just 6 weeks ago, probably, and asked him what was going on and how it felt, and he was just down. There was no positive light. Somebody who's my age, so he's in his late 30s, early 40s. So he had seen, he knew Hong Kong before the 1997 handover. And I know there was brain drain and money drain from Hong Kong leading up to 1997. But when I arrived in 2001, there was still a lot of energy, still a lot of optimism. It hadn't been that long since the handover, and Hong Kong was still pivotal. Shanghai in 2001 was not Shanghai in 2024. So Shanghai, Shenzhen, certain key economies in China that have grown and largely eclipsed what Hong Kong used to mean, what it meant for China in those years. Taiwan is certainly longer history. Everyone knew that the Hong Kong Treaty would only last 100 years. That was the idea, right? And 1987 was a firm date. Taiwan is a different beast. It's close. I'm amazed. I mean, you probably all read this as well. I think we knew it was happening, but to see it in newsprint that we had U.S. soldiers training Taiwan soldiers just miles from the Chinese mainland coast. I'm talking 3 miles, not 50 miles, right? Kind of not shocking, but still a little bit surprising. Even the Biden administration would have that happening. So, in terms of provocations back and forth, I see absolutely that in the Taiwan Strait there could be something happening that would certainly set off an incident. The same kind of thing. You look at what's happened with China and India over their frosty border. There's nothing up there except snow and rocks. They're still up there fighting over it, right? So. I think there are always reasons why. Some of the scholars who I follow talk about the inequitable distribution of men and women in China, right? How we have the sex imbalance, and in countries that have a sex imbalance in favor of men, they invariably end up going to war at some point because they need something to do with all of those excess men. And so those are things that make me nervous, right? I'm not saying I'm still on 75-25, let's say that nothing, no serious war would break out between over Taiwan, in Taiwan. That's 75% of me, but there's still a healthy 25% chunk of me that says there's absolutely the real possibility, and it's not going to be good for anyone.
Well, we've got 5 minutes or so here. I want to kind of pose the last question, but go to Leo, you first. Certainly you're from Hong Kong. I welcome you to provide your insights to the question of Hong Kong and Taiwan. But also the last question for each one of you, and starting with Leo, is what is it that you think Americans should know about China? Some misconceptions, lots of noise in the media. We've seen a lot of Asian hate, which has been around. I mean, it's, when I moved down to the Bay Area 3 years ago, and it did a tour at Alcatraz, was surprised. I always knew about the Chinese miners and railroad workers that came over to the United States, but just getting the sense of how institutional the slave labor was. That's just the word I can't come up with. Another word I can't come up with really was. So that was surprising. But I guess for each one of you, what is it going forward that we should be, as Americans, be mindful of about the U.S. China relationship? But Leo, to you about Hong Kong, Taiwan, and then the final question, please.
So I think one of the things you have to think about the difference between Hong Kong and Taiwan is that, as Jonathan pointed out, Hong Kong was scheduled, to return to China in 1997, and so there was kind of a firm deadline. Now, what happened over the last couple of decades is that the Hong Kong government pursued a wrong policy in terms of the growth and developments. They focus on real estate and finance social services rather than doing manufacturing. And almost all manufacturing had moved to China. And so, Shenzhen wouldn't be Shenzhen without all the capitals and human capital that migrated from Hong Kong to China. So if you think about China, Shenzhen essentially it was an extension of Hong Kong to a large part. As far as the danger of war, I would probably put it about 99 to like 1%, and 99% nothing happened. Continue just rhetorics back and forth. The reason being that you think about what happened. There's a couple weeks ago there was a Chinese fisherman that was caught fishing illegally over the water in Taiwan, and that was killed. And it should have been a major deal, but they talk under the table and say they just no big deal. So it was over. So I don't think that would be a major issue. The one thing that I think most people should know about China is you have to really think about it from a historical perspectives, and especially in the territorial issue. China, even the Communist Party, the reason why they were able to won the Civil War was because they promised to bring China to return to the glory days after 100 years of shame and humiliations. And Taiwan was annexed by Japan, and it was the only territory remaining that has not been fully returned to the Communist Party's led China. And so I think that's really one touchy issue Xi was trying to kind of like do complete as the final act, but I'm not sure you'll be able to accomplish that. So, learn more about the history of China and how the territorial issue is a very, very hot button issue, not just for the current administration, but throughout history. Any dynasty in the past, they have lost territory, eventually are no longer in power. So that's the observations that I have.
Thank you. Jonathan, and then we'll conclude with David. The question is, what is it that, your friends in Utah, your clients, your colleagues, what is it that you think they should know about China?
I think there's a lot of value in spending time learning someone else's language. The culture is encoded in the language. it's not an easy thing, especially for Americans. We grow up learning English. We make everyone else learn English. The British made everyone else learn English. You know, that effort that you put into learning someone else's language is worth it. And so, you know, whether it's Chinese or another language, I think it's absolutely important. And for me, of course, you know, 20 years ago, I found that and found it immensely enriching to my own life and understanding who I was, and also understanding that the world didn't revolve around me. You know, I play a crucial role to a handful of people in the world, and it's really good to know that everyone else plays their own pivotal role in their own space. So I'd say, you know, the Chinese people who I know, who I'm friends with, they work hard. They want the same thing we want for our families. And that's ultimately very empowering to understand that. You know, most people don't want conflict. They want to be able to peaceably live their lives and work hard and make a good living.
Thank you. David, final word, please.
Okay. I think Americans and other people that intersect with China should understand much more deeply about the society and the way it's structured. For example, I hear government officials, they talk, and they kind of spit it out. They say the Chinese Communist Party, and it's become a term of deprecation. And what I don't think a lot of these government people do understand is that the party and the government are two different things. The government acts as an agent for the party to carry out the party's instructions. And sometimes, as a China watcher, you can see things that are happening at the government level, like a committee under the State Council, which is like the cabinet, and it gets usurped by a leading group that gets established by the Communist Party, right? So that the party and the government are in cahoots. As I say, the government is an agent of the party, but at times there are little aspects of policy which are in conflict, and it's a nuance that isn't really understood by a lot of the talking heads I see talking about these issues. What should people know? Well, the people are nice. I mean, if I look at my own experience, you know, I'd meet people in my work, and they would come. They'd be visiting the university, say, from another part of the world, and they wouldn't speak perfect English. And yeah, let me deal with this and get on with my business would be my attitude. When I went to Hong Kong, I found that people were a lot nicer to me than I'd been to visitors when they visited my country. And I think that was a great blessing for me. It sort of made me much less parochial than I would have otherwise been. But as far as the Taiwan issue is concerned, you know, people in Hong Kong always recognized that they were a test case for Taiwan. And, you know, we've seen how it's played out, and the way they've managed Hong Kong has not led me to believe that the Taiwanese people will gladly return to the motherland. I don't see that. Having said that, however, I think China was badly done to with Taiwan being put under Japanese care and attention. I think it was a bad move by the international community. And there are lots of these moves geopolitically that can be criticized historically, but you know, they've happened. And so what you've got to do is to manage the process from where we are. Say sorry, but you know, wouldn't this be the best path from here on? But yeah, let's hope we are living in a world of greater enlightenment. But I don't think so.
Very good. I guess I'll maybe answer the question real quick and then conclude. I think what surprised me, and I don't know what the number is, but during the 2016 election, you know, a lot of rhetoric, and you had advertisements that kids in school are going to be learning, in American schools, going to be learning about what we call now the thought of Xi Jinping, and everyone's going to be learning Chinese, and we're going to have these sort of Chinese, manager overlords, and that was ridiculous, but it worked. A lot of Americans are afraid of that, but when someone said, well, China's taking over the world, and I don't remember the number, but something like 15 or 16 of the last 20 centuries, China had the largest economy in the world. Certainly during the Silk Road days, and the spices. And we're going back through history. It wasn't until the Spanish, with the Spanish Armada, the British Empire, and now the U.S. chapter. And so I think we have to learn from history. I agree, language, absolutely, but also need to learn from history and how the world operates. So I will say thank you. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for dealing with some of the technical challenges. But we made it through a great conversation. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that this was produced with the Silicon Valley Forum, which is a new nonprofit organization that I helped co-found just less than a month ago. And so looking forward to doing more events, both online as well as in person, and not just in-person events in California, but elsewhere in the US and worldwide. And we will conclude with that. Thank you, Jonathan Bench, Leo Chan, David Reid. A pleasure to have you part of the conversation. And thank you to our attendees. Sheshe, muchas gracias, and have a good night.
Nice meeting you all.
Thanks, Sam.
Well done. Well done organizing it.